I was introduced as the maid at Thanksgiving dinner, and no one even noticed. That was the moment I realized that in my own family, I wasn't even seen as a person anymore. My name is Lily Foster, and I'm 55 years old. I've spent most of my life doing everything I could to support my family, yet somehow, I've always felt invisible, like I didn't matter. And that Thanksgiving, it hit me harder than ever. My parents introduced me as the maid in front of everyone at the dinner table, and I just stood there, silent. The most humiliating part? No one even blinked. My brother, my cousins, even the neighbors, they all just nodded like it was the most normal thing in the world. I had spent days preparing this meal, just like every year, making sure everything was perfect. And when I finally thought I'd be able to sit down and share a meal with my family, I was reduced to nothing more than hired help. My parents didn't even bat an eye. They acted as if it was nothing, as if they'd never even thought of me as their daughter. It wasn't the first time I'd felt this way, but something about it this year made it unbearable. Maybe it was because I had been keeping it all inside for so long. Maybe it was because I was tired of pretending everything was okay when I knew deep down it wasn't. But that moment broke me. It was as if the universe had decided I was nothing more than an afterthought. And yet, one person at the table noticed. One person looked at me, saw the pain in my eyes, and didn't just ignore it. James, a family friend who had known me for years, looked at me differently. When my parents weren't paying attention, he leaned over and whispered, "You don't have to stand there. You're better than this." That was all it took. He knew who I really was. He knew the truth about my life. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. But that was just the beginning. The real story was about to unfold. What happened next would change everything I thought I knew about myself and my family. Because in that moment, I realized that it wasn't just about Thanksgiving. It was about my entire life, about how I had been treated and how I had let it happen. But no more. It was time to stop pretending, time to stop being the maid in my own family's eyes. I wasn't going to let them control my life anymore. This year, I was going to take back what was mine. And no one, not even my family, could stop me. I stood there, feeling the weight of every glance, every whisper, and yet I was invisible. After James spoke up, I found myself at a crossroads. The dinner continued as if nothing had happened, but in my mind, everything had changed. I could hear my parents' voices in the background, discussing the turkey, the wine, the weather, but it was all just noise. I wasn't listening anymore. How had I let myself fall so low? How had I allowed them to treat me like this for so long? It was a question I couldn't escape. As the evening wore on, I forced myself to smile and play the part. I cleared plates, refilled glasses, made small talk, all while my heart felt heavier with every passing second. But deep down, I knew I couldn't keep pretending. The years of being overlooked, dismissed, and belittled were adding up. I had spent so much of my life doing things for others, my family, my friends, always putting their needs before mine. I had given so much, but it never seemed to be enough. Every time I thought I had earned a little respect or love, it slipped away. I looked around the table, seeing the way my parents interacted with everyone else, my cousins, their friends, even the neighbors. Everyone was treated with respect and kindness. And then there was me, the maid. It was almost as if they had forgotten I was their daughter. I had spent countless hours cooking, cleaning, taking care of everyone. And yet when it came time for me to be seen and heard, I was nothing more than a servant. I excused myself from the table and went to the kitchen, hoping to find a moment alone to collect my thoughts. The house was quiet for a brief moment, and I leaned against the counter, taking a deep breath. What was I doing? How had I let this happen? I could feel the familiar sting of tears threatening to spill, but I refused to cry. Not now. Not in front of them. I had spent too many years crying in silence. I needed to do something about it. When I returned to the dining room, I tried to compose myself, but the anger was rising inside me. I wasn't angry at James for speaking up. I was angry at myself for allowing it to go on for so long. I had let my family define me, and in doing so, I had lost who I truly was. I couldn't let it continue. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the events of the evening in my mind over and over again. The way they treated me, the way I had stood there silently, the way I had felt so small. But there was something else, too. Something that had shifted inside me. I was done being invisible. I was done being the maid. I didn't know what the next step would be, but I knew I had to start standing up for myself. I couldn't keep living like this. The next day, I woke up with a sense of determination I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't going to let them continue to treat me like I was nothing. I was going to take control of my life, starting with the truth. And I knew that the first step was going to be the hardest. I was going to confront my parents. I had to. They had to know how I felt. They had to know that I was no longer willing to stay in the shadows of their neglect. So, I gathered my courage, stood tall, and walked into the living room where they were sitting, sipping their coffee, completely unaware of the storm that was about to hit them. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. My mother looked up, surprised. My father didn't even glance over. But I didn't care. This was my moment, and I wasn't going to back down. "I'm tired of being your maid. I'm tired of being invisible to you. I'm not just here to cook and clean. I'm your daughter, and I deserve to be treated with respect." My father's eyes met mine for the first time that morning. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The look on his face said it all. He had never considered how his actions had affected me, and now, he was forced to listen. I wasn't sure where this conversation would lead, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let them continue to treat me like I was invisible. I was going to make sure that from now on, I had a voice in this family. I woke up the next morning with a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in years. It was as though the conversation I had with myself during the night had somehow turned the volume up on my resolve. I had to confront the truth, and more importantly, I had to make them understand that I wasn't just a background character in my own life anymore. My mother had always been the one who set the tone for everything, and my father, though not overtly cruel, had always been distant. They never truly saw me, not as their daughter, not as someone with needs and desires. I was just there to take care of things. For so long, I had accepted that role, quietly swallowing my discomfort. But something shifted inside me that night. I was no longer willing to be their afterthought. As I made my way into the kitchen, the smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, but it couldn't hide the tension that had already settled in the house. I could sense that everything was about to change. I walked into the living room, where my parents were sitting as they usually did, talking about nothing important. The news was playing softly in the background, and my mother was knitting something, her hands moving as though they were on autopilot. My father was reading the newspaper, his attention fixed on the latest headlines. I cleared my throat, just loud enough to break the silence, but not too loud to startle them. They looked up at me. My father's eyes barely met mine before drifting away again. My mother, however, set her knitting down and looked at me with a small smile, the kind she always gave me when she thought I was about to say something trivial. "What's on your mind, Lily?" she asked, her tone not one of concern, but of mild curiosity. It was the kind of tone you use when you expect someone to say something that won't upset. "The status quo." But I wasn't here to preserve the status quo. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady. I was surprised at how calm I sounded. I had prepared for this moment, in my mind at least, for so long. But now that it was here, I didn't feel nervous. Instead, I felt a quiet, determined strength. My mother raised an eyebrow, setting her knitting aside entirely now. She wasn't used to me being this assertive, and I could tell she wasn't sure how to handle it. My father, still engrossed in the newspaper, barely reacted. I stood tall, meeting my mother's gaze. "I'm done being treated like the maid," I said, the words coming out more forcefully than I expected. "I'm not just here to take care of everyone, to cook and clean and disappear. I'm your daughter, and I deserve to be treated like one." There was a long pause, the room so still you could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. My mother's eyes softened for a moment, as though she were processing what I had just said. But then, she quickly masked it with her usual indifference. "Lily, dear, you know that's not how we see you. You're always so helpful," she said, her voice now tinged with a defensive edge. "We just don't know what we'd do without you around." My father, who had been silently reading, finally lowered the paper, his eyes meeting mine for the first time that morning. He didn't speak, but his gaze was steady, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like he was actually seeing me. I didn't break eye contact. "It's not about being helpful," I replied, my voice firm. "It's about respect. I've spent my life taking care of this house, this family, and in return, I get ignored, dismissed, and treated like I'm invisible. I'm tired of it." My mother's lips tightened, and I could see the defensiveness rise in her eyes. "Lily, you know we didn't mean it that way. You're just too sensitive." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She was dismissing my feelings again, just like she had done all these years. But this time, I wasn't going to let it slide. "No, Mom," I said, my voice trembling slightly but still unwavering. "I'm not being too sensitive. I've been ignored. For far too long. I've been invisible for so long that I don't even know who I am anymore." The words were out before I could stop them, and I knew it was the truth. For years, I had buried my own identity, my own needs, beneath the weight of trying to make everyone else happy. But now, I was finally starting to see myself again. My mother opened her mouth as if to speak, but I cut her off. "I'm not asking for your approval, and I'm not asking for your sympathy. I'm asking for respect. I'm asking for the same love and care that you give to everyone else in this family." My father finally spoke, his voice low but steady. "I didn't realize you felt that way," he said quietly. "I'm sorry, Lily. We never meant to make you feel like you weren't important." For a moment, I thought I might break down, but I held myself together. This was my moment, and I wasn't going to let it slip away. "I need you to understand," I said, my voice softening just a little. "I need to be seen for who I am, not just for what I do. I'm not your maid, and I'm not going to be treated like one anymore." There was a long silence, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel like I was invisible. I felt like I was finally being seen. And in that moment, I knew everything was about to change. I sat there, the silence hanging in the air like a thick fog, and for a moment, I wondered if I had made a mistake. Had I overstepped? Had I pushed too hard? But no, I knew I hadn't. I had spent too many years tiptoeing around my family's indifference. I had been too quiet for too long. Now, things had to change. My father's apology had caught me off guard, but it didn't quite settle the anger that was swirling inside me. I didn't want their pity. I didn't need their apologies. What I needed was respect, something I had longed for my entire life but had never received. "I don't want your apology, Dad," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I want things to be different. I want to matter in this family, not just as someone who cleans up and makes sure everything is running smoothly. I want to be seen as your daughter. I want to be loved for who I am, not what I do." The words were out before I could stop them, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid to say them. My mother sat there, her face hardening. "Lily, you're making too much of this," she said, her voice strained. "We love you. You know that." But I could hear the hesitation in her voice, the faint trace of doubt that had always been there. It was the same hesitation I had heard for years whenever I needed something from them, when I needed their love, their attention, their respect. It was always just out of reach. "If you love me, then why do I always feel like I'm invisible?" I asked, my voice cracking slightly. "Why do I always feel like I'm the last person you think about when it comes to anything important? Why do I have to fight so hard just to be seen by you?" The room was quiet. My father didn't say anything. My mother's face was unreadable. But inside, I felt a shift. I wasn't going to beg for their love anymore. I wasn't going to beg for their respect. If they couldn't give it to me, then I would have to give it to myself. I was done letting them make me feel small. I was done hiding in the shadows of their lives. "I've been carrying this family for so long," I said, more to myself than to them. "I've been the one who cooks, who cleans, who makes sure everything is taken care of. And for what? So that you can go on living your lives, oblivious to everything I do." I looked at them both, my heart pounding in my chest. I'm done with it. I'm done being invisible. I deserve more than this. My mother's eyes flickered for a moment, but she didn't speak. My father, on the other hand, looked up at me with a mix of confusion and guilt. He didn't understand. He didn't get it. He never had. And maybe he never would. "I don't know what you want from me, Lily," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. "We've always treated you well." "No, you haven't," I replied, my voice steady now. "You've treated me like I don't matter, like I'm just here to serve everyone else. But I'm not. I'm not just here to take care of everyone else while you all go on with your lives. I have my own life, my own dreams, my own needs. And I'm going to start putting myself first." My mother's face softened, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to change the years of hurt that had built up inside me. It wasn't enough to undo the damage that had been done. But it was a start. A small, but important start. "You've always been there for us, Lily," my father said quietly. "I know we've taken you for granted. It's not just about being there for you," I said, my voice firm. "It's about being seen, about being heard, about being respected. I've given everything to this family, and I'm not going to keep giving if I'm not getting anything in return. My mother opened her mouth to say something, but then closed it again. She didn't know what to say. She had never known what to say. And for once, I didn't need her to say anything. I just needed her to understand. I needed her to see me. I'm not going to be your maid anymore, I said, standing up. And I'm not going to keep sacrificing my own happiness for the sake of this family. I love you, but I'm done being the one who carries everything. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving my parents in stunned silence behind me. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know if they would ever understand. But for the first time in my life, I felt free. Free from the weight of their neglect. Free from the years of feeling invisible. And that was enough for me. It was the beginning of something new. The beginning of me finally taking control of my life. I woke up the next morning, feeling a mix of emotions I hadn't felt in years. Part of me felt lighter, almost liberated. The other part of me was still uncertain, unsure of what the future held. But one thing was clear. I wasn't going to go back to being the person I was before. I had finally stood up for myself, and now there was no turning back. I had always been the one to sacrifice, to put everyone else's needs before mine. I thought that was how I earned love and respect. But now, I realized how wrong I had been. I didn't have to keep sacrificing myself to be loved. The love I needed to find was the love I could give myself. The day passed quietly, but I knew something had shifted. My parents weren't quite the same around me. There was a discomfort in the air, a tension that hadn't been there before. I could feel their guilt, even though they didn't say a word. My mother, always the one to keep the peace, didn't know how to act. She wanted to apologize. I could see it in her eyes, but she didn't know how. And my father, well, he just stayed quiet, the same as always. I wasn't sure if they understood the depth of what I had said, but I wasn't expecting them to. This wasn't about getting their approval. It was about me finally stepping into my own power, about me saying enough is enough. But even though I had said my piece, the real test came when I saw my family again. My mother called me the next morning. "Lily, honey, I think we need to talk," she said, her voice tentative. I could hear the nerves in her words. She was trying, I could tell, but I wasn't sure if it would be enough. I agreed to meet her for lunch, and when I arrived, she was already waiting at the table. Her expression was serious, but there was a softness to her eyes that I hadn't seen before. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," she started, her voice quiet. "And I'm sorry. I never realized how much you were hurting. We've always just taken you for granted. We didn't see how much you were giving." I wasn't sure how to respond. Her apology wasn't what I had expected. I wanted to feel angry, but instead, I felt relief. Relief that she was finally acknowledging my pain, even if it was a little too late. "Thank you," I said, my voice steady. "But I need more than just words. I need to feel like I matter, like I'm not invisible." She nodded, looking down at her hands. "I know, Lily. I really do. And I want to change. I just don't know how to make it right." I looked at her, and for the first time in a long while, I saw the woman who had once been my mother, the woman who had loved me. But there was still so much left unsaid, so much more to fix. I knew that we couldn't just fix everything in one conversation, but it was a start. A small start, but a start nonetheless. As we sat there in silence for a moment, I realized that the hardest part wasn't the confrontation itself. The hardest part was accepting that things had to change, that I had to change, and that I wasn't the same person I had been. I had learned to stand up for myself, but I was still learning how to heal. I couldn't fix everything overnight, but I could take small steps toward reclaiming my life. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough for now. After lunch, I went home, but the weight of the conversation stayed with me. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I also knew I wasn't alone. I had taken back my voice, my power, and no one could take that away from me. The road ahead would be long, and I didn't know what it would look like, but for the first time in years, I felt like I had control. I didn't have to wait for anyone's approval or love. I was enough, just as I was. And that was something I had to believe, not just for them, but for me. I spent the next few days reflecting on everything that had happened. The conversation with my mother, though uncomfortable, had opened my eyes to just how much I had been suppressing. It wasn't just about the hurtful things my family had said or done. It was about the way I had allowed them to shape my sense of self-worth. I had lived my life trying to please everyone else, thinking that if I did enough for them, I would finally be seen and loved. But now, I was learning that love couldn't be earned through sacrifice alone. It had to be given freely, and it had to come from within. I wasn't sure what my next steps would be, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't keep living for them. I had to live for me. The realization was both liberating and terrifying. For so long, I had clung to the idea that my family's approval was the key to my happiness, but now I understood that I could no longer depend on them for validation. I had to find my own path, one that didn't revolve around their expectations. One morning, I decided to go for a walk in the park. The air was crisp, and the trees were just beginning to change color for the fall. I hadn't done something like that in years, just taking time for myself, without worrying about what others needed from me. As I walked, I thought about all the years I had spent taking care of everyone else. My parents, my brother, my cousins, all of them had relied on me to keep everything running smoothly. I had played the role of the dutiful daughter, the supportive sister, the reliable relative. But in the process, I had lost myself. The woman who had once had dreams and aspirations of her own had been buried beneath the weight of everyone else's needs. And I was done with it. I was done being the one who always put everyone else first. I was done being the one who was always there to clean up after everyone. I was done being the one who was invisible until they needed something. As the days passed, I started to take small steps toward reclaiming my independence. I began to do things for myself that I had neglected for years, reading books I had always wanted to read, taking long walks in the park, and even starting to explore new hobbies. It felt strange at first, but the more I did it, the more I realized how much I had been depriving myself. I was no longer willing to let my life revolve around my family's needs. It wasn't easy. The old habits were hard to break. There were times when I felt guilty for not doing more for them, for not being the person they had always relied on. But then I would remind myself, I had given enough. It was time to take care of me. One afternoon, my mother called me again. This time, her voice was softer, more tentative. "Lily, I've been thinking," she said. "I know I've let you down, and I want to do better. I know I've taken you for granted for so long, and I don't want to keep doing that." I took a deep breath before responding. "I appreciate that, Mom. But I need you to understand that I can't keep sacrificing myself for the family. I've done it for years, and it's not fair to me anymore. I need you to respect my boundaries." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I understand," she said quietly. "And I'm sorry. I really am. I'll try to do better. I just want you to know that I love you." Hearing her say that meant more to me than I could put into words. For the first time, I felt like my mother truly saw me, not as someone who was just there to take care of things, but as her daughter, as a person with my own needs and desires. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. That evening, I took a moment to reflect on how far I had come in such a short time. The path I was on wasn't easy, and I knew there would be challenges ahead. But for the first time in my life, I felt like I was taking control of my own story. I was no longer waiting for someone else to give me permission to live my life. I was living it for me, and that was all that mattered. The next few weeks brought more change. My family adjusted to my new boundaries, some more easily than others. But I stood firm. I wasn't going to let their expectations dictate my life anymore. I was going to make my own decisions, live my own life, and for the first time in years, I felt free. I wasn't sure what the future held, but I was ready to face it. Because I knew that no matter what happened, I was no longer invisible. I had finally found my voice. I woke up feeling different. The world outside my window seemed brighter, even though nothing had physically changed. I had been living in a fog for so long, unsure of who I was. But now there was a clarity inside me that I hadn't experienced in years. I had stood up for myself, and I was finally starting to feel like I mattered. But the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. My family had grown used to me being the one who always gave in, the one who never questioned their behavior. Changing that dynamic was going to take time, and I wasn't sure if they were ready for it. The first test came when I visited my parents a few days later. They had invited me over for dinner, a quiet evening they promised would be different. When I arrived, I could sense the tension in the air. My father was watching TV, as usual, while my mother was busy in the kitchen. But there was an awkwardness to everything, a quiet discomfort that made my skin crawl. As soon as I stepped into the living room, my mother looked up, her face carefully neutral. "Lily, we're glad you could come," she said, but her tone didn't match her words. It was polite, but distant, as though we were strangers instead of family. I sat down at the table, not saying anything at first. My father mumbled a hello, but quickly returned to his show. It was as if they were waiting for me to break the silence. I didn't. Instead, I looked around the room, noticing how everything had stayed the same. The furniture, the pictures on the wall, the same worn-out rug on the floor. It felt like nothing had changed at all. "I've been thinking," I said finally, breaking the silence, "about what I said the other day." Both of them looked up at me, my mother's hands frozen in place as she stirred the soup on the stove. My father lowered the remote, his gaze now focused on me. "I hope you know I wasn't just being dramatic," I continued. "I meant every word. I can't keep living this way, pretending that everything is fine when it's not." My mother sighed, setting the spoon down with a soft clink. "Lily, you're overreacting. You know how much we appreciate you. We just don't know how to show it." "That's the problem, Mom," I said, my voice steady but firm. "You never knew how to show it. You've always treated me like I'm here to take care of everything. But I'm not just here to serve you." There was a long pause before my father spoke, his voice quieter than usual. "I never meant for you to feel that way, Lily," he said. "We've always depended on you, but we never stopped to think about how that made you feel. I can see now that we've been selfish." I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time in my life, I saw the man who had raised me, not as my father, but as a person. He wasn't perfect, and he wasn't always the father I wanted, but he was trying. And that meant something. "I need you both to understand something," I said, my voice softer now. "I've spent my whole life giving and giving, and I never asked for anything in return. But I can't keep doing that. I need you to respect me, to see me as more than just the person who takes care of everything. I'm your daughter, and I deserve to be treated like one." My mother nodded slowly, her eyes filled with something that looked like regret. "I know we've failed you, Lily," she said quietly, "but we're willing to change. We want to do better." I didn't know if I believed her, but I wasn't going to let that stop me. "I'm not asking for your promises," I said. "I'm asking for action. I need to see that you're willing to put in the effort to change." The room was silent again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. It wasn't uncomfortable, it was hopeful. My parents were finally seeing me, really seeing me, and for the first time, I felt like maybe, just maybe, things could be different. The rest of the dinner passed quietly. We ate, but it wasn't the same as before. There were no forced smiles, no pretending that everything was perfect. There was honesty in the air, and though it was awkward at times, it felt like progress. As I left their house that night, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. I didn't know what the future held for me and my family, but I knew I was no longer going to let them define me. I was taking control of my own life, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that from me again. I had made it clear to my parents that things had to change, and for the first time in my life, I felt a sense of control that I hadn't experienced before. But even though they seemed willing to try, there was still a lingering doubt in my mind. Would they really change? Or was this just another round of empty promises? The days that followed were filled with moments of tension and quiet reflection. My parents, in their own way, were trying to adjust, but it was clear that old habits die hard. I could see the effort they were putting in, but I also saw the resistance, the hesitation that came from years of doing things the same way. My father started to take a more active role in household chores, but it was clear he didn't know how to do much more than the basics. My mother, on the other hand, began to show more interest in my life, asking how I was doing, what I had been up to, but there was still an underlying sense that she was only doing it because she felt obligated, not because she genuinely cared. It was frustrating. I knew that change wasn't going to happen overnight, but I couldn't help feeling disappointed. I had finally stood up for myself, and now that I was seeing the shift I had wanted, it didn't feel as fulfilling as I had imagined. One afternoon, I decided to take a break from the constant tension and went out for a walk. The crisp autumn air was refreshing, and for a moment, I let myself just be. I didn't have to worry about anyone else. I didn't have to worry about whether my parents were really changing or if they were just going through the motions. I had made my peace with it. It wasn't my responsibility to fix them. I couldn't make them see things my way, and I had to accept that. As I walked through the park, I realized that this was a turning point for me. I had always been the one who carried the weight of everyone else's expectations, but now, I was learning to put myself first. I wasn't going to wait for anyone's approval to live my life. It was a scary thought, but it also felt incredibly liberating. I had spent so many years being the one who took care of everyone, but now, it was time to take care of myself. When I returned home that evening, something inside me had shifted. I no longer felt the need to constantly prove myself to my parents. I no longer felt like I had to be everything to everyone. I could just be. I spent the next few weeks working on myself, focusing on my own growth. I started taking up activities I had neglected for years, things that brought me joy: reading, gardening, even taking a cooking class. It wasn't about doing things to impress others or to get their approval. It was about doing things for me. Slowly, I began to rebuild my confidence. I felt stronger, more at peace with myself. I knew that my relationship with my parents wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. What mattered was that I had finally learned to stand up for myself. I had finally learned to set boundaries. And in doing so, I had learned how to love myself. As time went on, the relationship between my parents and me started to evolve. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. They still had their flaws, but so did I. And that was okay. I realized that the road to healing wasn't about expecting perfection from others, but about accepting them as they were, while also accepting myself. I wasn't going to let anyone define my worth anymore. I was in control of my own story, and that was all that mattered. I didn't realize how much had truly changed until one evening, about a month later, when I sat across from my parents at dinner, and for the first time in my life, I felt seen. It wasn't because they had said anything extraordinary or made any grand gestures. It was because, for once, the atmosphere was different. There was no tension, no unspoken expectations, no discomfort. My parents had adjusted, and so had I. I had stopped expecting them to be the parents I had always wanted them to be. I had stopped waiting for them to love me the way I had always hoped. Instead, I had learned to love myself. I had learned to set boundaries, and in doing so, I had found a sense of peace. As the days went by, I started to feel more at home in my own life. I had the freedom to make my own choices without feeling guilty about it. I could decide how I wanted to spend my time, what made me happy and what didn't. It wasn't always easy. There were moments when I felt myself slipping back into old habits, when I felt the urge to take care of everyone else before myself. But I fought those urges. I reminded myself that I mattered. I reminded myself that my needs were just as important as anyone else's. And that was something I had never truly believed before. I spent more time doing things that made me feel fulfilled. I enrolled in a painting class I had always wanted to take, but never had the courage to. I started volunteering at a local animal shelter, something that brought me joy and a sense of purpose. Slowly but surely, I found myself growing stronger, both emotionally and mentally. But the real test came when my family invited me to another holiday dinner. It was Christmas this time. I was hesitant at first. After everything that had happened, I wasn't sure if I was ready to face them again, to see if they had really changed. But I decided to go. When I walked into their house that evening, I was prepared for the usual awkwardness. I expected to feel out of place, to feel like I had to justify myself. But instead, there was a warmth that I hadn't felt before. My mother greeted me with a genuine smile. My father gave me a brief but sincere hug. They didn't treat me like the maid anymore. They treated me like their daughter. It wasn't perfect, and it didn't erase the past, but it was a step forward. As the night went on, I could see the effort they were making. They listened when I spoke, and they didn't interrupt or dismiss me. They didn't act like everything was fine when it wasn't. They were trying, and that meant something. But what meant even more to me was how I had changed. I no longer needed their approval. I no longer needed them to validate me. I had finally found my worth. I had finally found my voice, and no one could take that away from me. As I sat there, surrounded by my family, I realized that I had broken free from the chains that had bound me for so long. I was no longer living for them. I was living for me. And for the first time in my life, I felt truly at peace. The road to this point had been long and difficult, but it had been worth it. I had learned that I didn't need to keep sacrificing myself to be loved. I didn't need to keep proving my worth. I was enough, just as I was. And that was the greatest gift I had ever given myself.